The first workshop of the afternoon, Demystifying Supply Chain Visibility and Traceability with GS1, will be led by Andrew Meyer. Andrew Meyer, in his role as Director of Global Standards at GS1 US, is responsible for developing and advancing GS1 standards to support visibility and traceability initiatives in healthcare. He is tasked with supporting the efforts of the RX secure supply chain and the industry's use of GS1 standards to meet the complex requirements of federal healthcare regulations. Andrew works with GS1 teammates to help promote the adoption of RFID and EPCIS to help drive supply chain visibility. He is a co-facilitator of the GS1 US Healthcare RFID Workgroup, which published the GS1 Healthcare US Implementation Guideline for RFID in healthcare manufacturing. Before GS1 US, Andrew spent over 2 decades in the pharmaceutical industry in his role as Director of Operational Compliance at Mutual Drug. He worked with industry peers and trade organizations to find novel solutions to the complex problems posed by state and federal traceability regulations. Later, he worked for LSpedia, a DSCSA solution provider in the Director of Supply Chain role, where he and his team help companies comply with the requirements of DSCSA. Andrew, welcome.
Let me find my mute button. No, thank you, John. It's wonderful to be here today. I always look forward to this meeting every year, and so it's great to be part of this. Today, I'm going to be talking about demystifying the supply chain using visibility and traceability based on GS1 standards. And with that, let's go ahead and get going. And Holly, if you would prefer to click, I can just say next, and let's go ahead and do it that way. So next slide, please. Okay, so as you all are aware, that any of you that have hung out in a GS1 meeting in the past or a GS1 US meeting in the past, is that we always have to go over a couple of housekeeping items. The first is the antitrust slide, which essentially says that we ask and expect everyone to refrain from discussing prices, margins, discounts, suppliers, the timing of price changes, marketing or product plans, or other competitively sensitive topics. If anybody on the call has any questions about the propriety of a conversation, don't hesitate to raise your hand and put a question in chat, or notify someone, and we can table that until the legal team has a chance to look at it. If you are bored at night, feel free to use the link below to have some nice nighttime reading to put you to sleep. But the reality is that we are neutral. We do not play favorites at GS1 US and intend to keep it that way. Next slide, please. The legal disclosure slide I will not read to you. Essentially, we are providing this presentation as is. This presentation doesn't understand or take a look at individual business policies that your company may have. So before you do anything that's recommended in this presentation today, make sure that you do your due diligence on your side and ensure that these processes work for your company. And the last thing that I'll touch on, since I will be talking about both FSMA and DSCSA today, is that GS1 US employees are not representatives or agents of the US FDA. And the content of this presentation has not been reviewed, approved, or authorized by the US FDA. Next slide, please. All right, so we've gone over a little bit about who I am for the most part. And so let's go ahead and dig in as soon as I find the Zoom again. There we are, sorry. Let's go ahead and dig into the meat of the presentation. And so what we have is we're going to step through the agenda, which is the visibility challenge. I'll talk a little bit about why visibility became important in the supply chain. And then I'll go into the power of GS1 standards and why it's essential, or why they are essential to help grant visibility across the supply chain, what our role is, how you achieve visibility through standards, talk a little bit about traceability beyond visibility and building trust, traceability and use. We'll go over some lessons from industry and then some tools for the future. All right, next slide, please. So the first thing that we have is the is during the pandemic, it became apparent that there were some blind spots in the supply chain with the way that product was not moving properly across the supply chain. It kind of rippled across from China and worked its way through to the Western Hemisphere based on the shelter at home uh, requirements that were passed out and the inability of workers to actually get to work because they were ill in the Eastern Hemisphere. And so as that rippled across, it became very apparent that there needed to be a more digitized supply chain. And the reason for that is that it became it became obvious that without the digitization across the supply chain, visibility and the ability to understand where products were at, what state those products were in, and how those products were going to move through the supply chain would be greatly curtailed. And so what happened in 2020 is that digitization started to accelerate. And according to a McKinsey report that was issued late 2020, the marketplace, the supply chain as a whole, accelerated its digitization rate by 7 years in that 1 year alone. All right, next slide, please. So before I can go into how GS1 has worked with supply chain partners um, in order to meet the needs, I have to first um, talk a little bit about who GS1 is. So next slide, please. So GS1 is a neutral, not-for-profit, and we are user-driven and governed, both global and local, inclusive and collaborative. And essentially what that means is that GS1 is a federated model. Then Global Office works to harmonize the standards across the globe to ensure that supply chains everywhere can work with the same standards and have a normative standard that all industries can apply around the world. Then what you have is the federated members like ourselves. GS1 US is a member organization that's located in the United States. And what we do is we bring the supply chain communities together for the US and work with their challenges and their problems based on issues that they bring to us. And that's where the user-driven and governed comes in, is our end users send us problems. We bring those to the industry ELC leads. So we have them for healthcare, AGM, food, etc. And those executive leadership committees then hand down work streams to the various working groups. Next slide, please. All right, so these numbers are a little bit dated. I've seen numbers that are greater. I tried to run more conservative based on just wanting to make sure that everything I said today was 100% accurate. But 1.5 million companies around the world today use GS1 standards on a day-to-day basis. And there are more than 6 billion with a B barcodes scanned each day. I've seen numbers up to 10 billion, but since this has gone through legal, I'm going to run with this number today. Over 36 million GTINs and 600,000 GS1 company prefixes currently exist in the GS1 US Data Hub product tool. And then lastly, from this slide, more than 37 million products are registered by brand owners in the GS1 Global Data Synchronous Network, which I'll probably refer to from here on out as GDSN, just as a heads up. Next slide, please. Okay. So there are over 110 member organizations around the globe. Again, we're a federated model, so GS1 Global handles the normative standard that's been set up to ensure that globally the standards are harmonized and can be used, and then the local MOs work within the regulations and with the end users to ensure that the standards can meet the needs that they have. And I'll go over some examples of that later on with FSMA and the DSCSA. Next slide, please. Okay. So let me get myself caught up. All right, so GS1 We believe in one foundation, so we have created a singular foundation that can be applied across industries and across businesses to help ensure that they can all work together as a cohesive supply chain. Next slide, please. And then that cohesive supply chain and that foundation creates a common language, or creates excuse me, a common purpose for businesses and be able to move forward. Obviously, we believe in the power of standards to transform the way we live and work, and we do that by creating that common foundation that I just referred to. That common foundation allows industries across the supply chain to accurately capture and automate their processes around the objects that live in their ecosystems. In addition to that, we enable the visibility needed to be able to track those items and to record those events as those products move throughout the ecosystems and across the supply chain. And then lastly, we empower businesses to grow by improving efficiency, safety, security, and sustainability. Next slide, please. All right, so GS1 has one common language that we speak. And the reason this is important is because that common language allows all businesses, whether big or small, to be able to speak the same language whenever they share data with each other. And that data can be master data, it can be transactional data, or it can be object event data. In addition to that, the way we speak that language and share that language with each other, whenever you get past just the data share and start looking at the physical capture devices or the capture technologies that we use with barcodes and RFID, it creates a predictable way for companies to be able to decipher that information or read those tags and barcodes as they move through the system. Next slide, please. Okay, so our primary focus areas are on the left-hand side. I'm not going to read the entire slide to you. Those of you that are familiar with us know that we believe in accurately identifying products, including their master data pieces out and around in repositories like the GDSN or Data Hub, where it can be shared with your trading partners. And then those data foundations start moving you and your trading partners towards inventory efficiency, information about products and locations, and so on and so forth, as you see on the left-hand side. We have four primary work streams for industries that we work with that we are dedicated and promote inside heavily and work with industry to come up with solutions. And that would be the apparel and general merchandise, food service, healthcare, and retail grocery industries. Next slide, please. All right, so GS1's role in the supply chain. So now that I've told you who we are and what we believe in and how we move forward, what we do is, next slide, please. We make collaboration possible. As I said, we're end user driven, and so we convene with our members with representation across the supply chain. So from the manufacturer down to the eventual end user. If it's in healthcare, it's a hospital system. In apparel or AGM, it's going to be a retailer. Same with food service in many industries or many instances. And what we do with that grouping of people is we look at the problems that occur within their supply chain. We work on ways to develop information standards to support their pain points. And then we also work towards creating best practices for each of those verticals. And lastly, again, we do ensure that we have representation from across the supply chain. Whenever I say manufacturer down to retailer or service provider, that also includes wholesalers, 3PLs, solution providers, et cetera. We try to make sure that we have representation of every actor within a supply chain. That way, the solutions and best practices that we come up can be used across that entire supply chain, not just in pockets. Next slide, please. So we also make efficiency possible. Whenever you have a supply chain talking the same language cohesively from end to end, it means that you don't have to interpret the data that you're receiving or the barcodes that you receive before you can understand the data content that they have. It means that natively you can pull the data into your systems and apply it to your work streams, enabling you to have efficiency and to help you automate the processes that you do day to day. Next slide, please. And then we also make safety possible, again, by standardizing the identification of products and assets and locations. We have enabled a way for companies to share information between trading partners, and that sharing increases visibility and thereby traceability. A lot of the work we do today is around supporting the Food Modernization or the Food Safety Modernization Act, otherwise known as FSMA, or by supporting Food and Drug Administration initiatives like the UDI work, Unique Device Identification, or the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, otherwise known as the DSCSA. And the work in those is mainly around trying to ensure that patients are receiving products when they need them, the correct products that they need, et cetera, and also to ensure that those products are not counterfeit, have not been diverted or moved outside the normalized supply chain. And the same with food, ensuring that the FDA and regulators can remain proactive instead of reactive whenever foodborne illness occurs. Next slide, please. Lastly, by making visibility possible. And obviously, when everyone's speaking the same language and they are able to share the language in a common vocabulary or a common schema, it allows you to share important critical events that occur to products as they move through the supply chain. And it also helps you understand who you're sending what to, when you're sending it to them, and what state it's in as you send them those products. And through that, it allows you to accurately answer who, what, when, where, and why. Next slide, please. Okay, so achieving standards through visibility, or achieving visibility through standards, excuse me. Next slide, please. GS1 runs on 3 essential pillars, and those pillars are identify, capture, and share. As you look through those different pillars, or horizontal brackets as you see on the screen in front of us, you'll see the kind of different groupings of information and technologies that we use across industries, essentially starting with identify. Identify is around identifying the objects throughout your supply chain, be it companies, products, locations, etc. And then you have capture, which is about it's the physical embodiment of share. So as you capture information about products on the barcodes and the packaging that's moving through the supply chain, it's your first route to share. It's a non-digitized version of share, but those technologies allow you to share information about the immediate package that they're looking at. It also allows you to let them know some important attribute information as it moves through, much like we do today with 2D barcodes, GS1 128 barcodes, or EPC-enabled RFID. And then lastly, you have the share pillar, which is around essentially exactly what it sounds like, sharing data with your trading partners. That can be master data, because without accurate master data, everything else is going to fail from that point on. So it's important to have solid master data and mechanisms to receive that information in a timely manner from your trading partners. Also transactional data, if you think about EDI and the way that EDI is designed. And then lastly, physical event data like EPCIS. And we'll be discussing EPCIS a little bit later in this discussion. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've dug into these pretty deep, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend a super huge amount of time on each one of these slides. But essentially, I put these slides in the deck so that you could understand when and where certain types of identification are used throughout the supply chain. Some of the identification that you see, like the SSCC, exists purely for logistic movement from point A to point B. Other ones like GLNs and GTINs are permanent and exist even beyond the production of products or the lifetime of that company. Those identifiers will exist in permanence forever. But SSCCs are transient in nature and exist for the logistic purposes. We also have other less adopted but growing in adoption identification like the GIAI and GRAI. over on the asset side. There is an increasing need for understanding where your assets are and how they're interacting with your other products. And we are seeing those two identifiers being picked up as well. Next slide, please. I'm also not going to belabor this slide. The GS1 data carriers range from linear barcodes, like you see on the top, the EAN UPC, which has been the stalwart for the past 50 years and is the king of the point of sale checkout. Also, the GS1 data bar, which was released a little bit later, used heavily on produce and other types of fresh foods, but hasn't enjoyed the stickiness of the EAN UPC. And then over on the right-hand side, you have commonly used supply chain barcodes, the GS1 128 and the ITF14. And in the middle, you have the GS1 data matrix, which has shown up more recently in regulatory uses like direct part marking for UDI and the DSCSA for SNI plus attribute information. Down on the bottom, you have RFID, which is ramping up in use as of late. And then on the right-hand side, you have the digital link QR code and data matrix. Essentially, digital link is a web-compatible URI that allows you to control the information that when it's scanned, when those barcodes, either the QR or the data matrix are scanned, you can control the information that is delivered to the individual on the other side based on application needs or functionality needs that have permissions loaded around them. Next slide, please. All right, the last set I will talk about is the share, a little bit more in depth. GDSN, everything starts with good quality master data, and both GDSN and GS1 US Data Hub both supply master data. GDSN is a larger group of attributes. Data Hub is a subset of those attributes, and then EDI again transactional information, and EPCIS is physical event data. We'll be talking a lot about EPCIS throughout this discussion today. EPCIS is kind of the kingpin whenever it comes to object visibility and understanding what's happened with an object as it moves through the supply chain. Next slide, please. Just a little bit of additional information about Data Hub. Data Hub actually has two other functionalities. Not only does it have Data Hub location, but it has Data Hub product and Data Hub company, which allow you to utilize it for other pieces of information than just either location information or product information. Next slide, please. Okay, now that I've pillared you to death, I'm just going to mention again that we have the three pillars. Those pillars build the global language of business through the identify, capture, and share mechanisms that our end users have helped us create over the years. And they enable you to automate your processes and share information between trading partners, either automatically or as a triggered methodology based on shipment or whatever that trigger may be. Next slide, please. Okay. The supply chain is an ecosystem. The reality is, whenever you start moving into talking about visibility, most of what I've shown up to this point has shown a linear supply chain. The reality is the supply chains are much messier than that. Products are created by one manufacturer. Those products are inputs for another manufacturer. Eventually, that manufacturer sends stuff to a wholesale distributor or 3PL. They may send it directly down to a retail store, or they may send it to someone else who converts it into another product entirely. And eventually it gets all the way to the consumer at the end of the supply chain, be it a patient or be it somebody who needs to buy a shirt of some sort. The reality is that there's information that you need to understand. And during the pandemic, there was a realization that a tanker, or not a tanker, but a cargo ship that's loaded with containers that ends up getting parked because the pandemic, it may sit there for months, meaning that the supply chain has now been disrupted with all of that product that's on that container ship is now not expected at the stores. But do the stores know that? Do they know where their shipment is? And the reality is that it became very apparent that you needed to have that visibility. And then additionally, with longer term or older processes like recalls, it's become very apparent that you need to understand where products are in the supply chain, who products have been sold to, what their movement is, what their status is, so that whenever the consumer receives a product, they can be sure that it's not been recalled or that it's not expired. And really, the idea around visibility is an idea of being able to ensure that you understand what the status of a given product is at any given time in your ecosystem. Next slide, please. The GS1 US, we believe that trust starts and grows with visibility. Next slide, please. And so some of the ways that supply chain visibility creates trust is it allows you to keep up with consumer demands. It enables you to streamline your trading partner communications, offers you real-time inventory, maximizes consumer and patient safety. The reality is that all of these things together help you enhance interoperability whenever you're speaking in a single language. But in order to garner both brand trust, consumer trust, and to understand where your products are and ensure that you have them on hand when you need them, visibility is what builds that ability to do all of that. And all of these things that you see on the screen end up building trust for both your brand, for the supply chain and your trading partners as this data is shared. Next slide, please. Okay, the GS1 US supply chain visibility wheel. I believe this is the only slide that I have that's automated throughout this entire presentation. But really the purpose here is GS1 has worked to create this visibility wheel. And if you look at the outside, it's been broken into three quadrants, and those three quadrants are around inventory management, traceability, and then sustainability. I'm going to be talking a fair amount about traceability here in a few minutes, but sustainability and inventory management also build that up. And so with all three of these aligned, you begin to be able to create the middle circle, which are the use cases that you can apply that visibility to. And then obviously, since it's GS1 US that created this, at the heart of all of this, GS1 standards work to power that with, again, the identify, capture, and share. The reality is that we believe standards lay the foundation for visibility and interoperability in the supply chain. Next slide, please. All right, so ROIs from visibility. So accurate information drives greater sales. If you can understand what kind of inventory you need for each of your products that you sell, or how many of each product you need to produce, then it allows you to focus on the areas that you need to focus on, not bulk up in areas that you believe may be the areas that you need to actually bulk up on in order to drive sales, which means that your outcomes are better and your sales are better ultimately. With master data, clean data saves time. You aren't spending your time cleaning up your data pools. Saves money in the long run and resources, because anytime you have to work to massage data, you're spending FTEs, you are losing time and correcting data that's already gone through the system. And so it's important to make sure that you have it right at the beginning. The reality is that less product waste makes it so that you save money again. You're better able to identify affected lots for recall and better freshness management. And really what that comes down to is lot management and expiration date management whenever you're working with perishable goods. The other side, as far as the less product waste goes, it allows you to understand again how many products you need in order to meet the number of turns that you're looking to meet based on your storage space. And turns are essentially how long does it take a product to move through your ecosystem. The next section is processes. Standardization allows you to have greater efficiency across your processes. It allows you to create transparency in your ecosystem. Via that automation, it allows you to manage things that you're currently manually managing by automating them with back-end functionality. And then lastly, throughout all of that, you get enhanced consumer and patient safety. And then, as I was saying with the digital link barcodes, the QR, digital link enabled barcodes like the QR and the data matrix, you can start driving things like consumer engagement, brand loyalty, and additional safety to notify those end consumers of recalls or whatever it is that you need to drive down to the consumer. You start having vehicles to be able to do that. Next slide, please. All right, traceability is beyond visibility and building trust. Next slide, please. All right, so traceability starts with the unique identification of products and locations. And here you're identifying locations with the GLNs and and the products with GTINs, otherwise known as global trade item numbers. And at the item or case level, you may be capturing information via GS1 data carrier, which would be one of the barcodes we looked at earlier. And then by implementing standards-based traceability, you can better, more reliably track products through supply chains to help ensure consumer safety. And some of the use cases are listed here on the screen, from recall down through anti-counterfeit and being able to tell provenance of a product. The reality is that traceability equates to visibility plus time. In order to have traceability of a product, you have to understand where that product's been over time throughout the supply chain and understand what status it is. It's in as it moves through the supply chain. Next slide, please. Okay, so some of the benefits that we just talked about. The first one around recall, and recalls occur across multiple industries, if not all industries, but especially around food and medical products. And really, the benefit of minimizing recalls as a result of enhanced supply chain visibility are that you get enhanced food safety, so you're able to remove products off the shelves quicker, and that's actually true for healthcare as well. And then you get increased cost savings from lot level removal of product instead of having to remove an entire product line. We've seen some recalls in healthcare where they've had to remove the entire NDC from the product line or from the supply chain because either they did not correctly record the batch lot whenever they were creating the product, or because they didn't understand who they were selling what lots to when they were selling them. And so it was just safer to remove all of the products from the supply chain. Next slide, please. Okay, so the need for cold chain exists across multiple industries as well, especially in food and medical, but it also exists in the inert gas supply chain. So if you think about moving cryogenic materials or those kind of products across, they also require cold chain. And the reality is that visibility gives you the ability to understand what temperatures or if temperature excursions have happened as products move through the supply chain. As far as healthcare and safety goes, if you think about vaccines that move in a cold chain, or insulin products or other types of products that require to be held at a certain temperature as they migrate across from one trading partner to another, it's important to be able to log those exceptions as they occur to ensure that the patients are safety on the other end. And then lastly, I've mentioned FSMA a couple times already, but they're one of the original outlines from FSMA, or the requirements from FSMA, is that you have to make sure that for food products and medications that you can record accurately and report out those temperatures that are associated with those products at a regulated time or at a regular cadence, and ensure that you can catch exceptions as soon as they happen. GS1 standards have ways to convey all of this information and share this information if need be. And next slide. And then chain of custody, visibility allows you to have visibility and traceability allow you to have chain of custody or visibility of chain of custody across industries. And really, this becomes important whenever you start talking about sustainability initiatives, whether it's for your company trying to improve their sustainability impact on the world, or whether or not it's your end customers who are finding it important to make sure that they support companies that are trying to be eco-conscious and produce products in a sustainable way. Uh, greater greater transparency and data exchange of faulty products. So again, leaning back into the recall area a little bit, and then lastly, enhanced consumer and patient safety. Understanding where your products are coming from allows you to understand the impacts that they've had as they've come to you. Next slide, please. This is the last one of these, I promise everyone. All right, so anti-counterfeit and provenance is needed across industries. And as products move through the supply chain, it has been proven that companies will divert these products and either stockpile them to ensure that they can garner a larger market share, or you'll have companies that will outright counterfeit or divert products to hold them out to reintroduce at a later point, either through cargo theft or some other mechanism. The reality is that having visibility enables you to identify the points where products have abnormal occurrences throughout the supply chain, allowing you to understand when those products come back into the supply chain, that they are something that you should look deeper into to ensure that those products are the actual products that they're being represented as. And in addition, those products are safe for human consumption or use. Next slide, please. Okay, one more slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about traceability and use. So I've beat you all up with facts or with a bunch of slides talking about the niceties and what traceability and visibility do at a high level. And now we're going to actually step into a couple of areas as far as FSMA and DSCSA to talk about how standards are being used in order to help the supply chain move forward. And so with FSMA, the reality is that the era of regulated traceability in the food goes back to 2002, whenever President Bush signed the Bioterrorism Act into law. The Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law in January of 2011 by President Obama. And really, ever since then, FSMA has aimed to ensure that the U.S. food supply chain is safe from basically by shifting focus on prevention instead of response. It was realized, though, several years into that original enactment, that the documentation processes that were required and the work that had to be done was still very time consuming. And it was difficult for the FDA to conduct foodborne illness investigations and find the origin of the problem. And this is largely because there was no standardized framework for food companies, and they were all collecting and storing data in various ways. In their own four walls, but storing it in different schemas, different layouts, and capturing different information that they would need to be able to produce whenever it was asked for. What it ended up happening is that the FDA had a very difficult time connecting the dots as they were trying to work backwards through foodborne illness to ensure that they were able to quarantine or recall the products that needed to be recalled. So what is FSMA 204? It's a rule that lays out specific requirements on additional traceability records for all supply chain stakeholders that either manufacture, process, pack, or hold foods on the food traceability list. This really covers a lot of high-risk foods such as leafy greens, shell eggs, nut butter, freshly cut fruits and vegetables, and it also covers both foreign and domestic entities. The FDA has also outlined full and partial exemptions that may apply, and those lists can be found on their site. So what's required by the law? So the companies that are named or that we just talked about will be required to keep and share detailed traceability records with the FDA within 24 hours. These traceability records include specific standardized KDE or key data elements, or otherwise known as attributes to those of us in the GS1 world. And then those need to be captured for specific CTEs or critical tracking events or activities within the supply chain. An example of this is when a product is harvested, cooled, shipped, received, or transformed. And then Lastly, the traceability lot code is only assigned when a product is initially packed, transformed, or for seafood at the first point that it touches land for receiving. It also prohibits reassignment of this lot code unless one of these three things is performed. So next, as far as what companies must do, companies must also keep a traceability plan describing things like the procedures that they use to maintain the traceability records, how do they identify items in the FTL, how is TLC, how the TLC or traceability lot code is assigned, if that's applicable, and who is the point of contact that can answer questions on the plan. Farm maps showing the areas in which you grow and raise such foods. So it's not just data collection, it's actually ensuring that you have information that shows you how you plan on collecting your data, who you're collecting your data from, and who you're working with. And then what's the timing on this? So the final rule was effective January 2023. The compliance date was set for January 20, 2026, and all records have to be maintained for 2 years. Next slide, please. Thank you. On the screen, you see kind of a infographic on all the products that are listed. Some of them are pretty far-reaching whenever you get into the world of cut fruits or cut vegetables. And yeah, so I'm not going to read all of those off to you, but go ahead and give it a second, let it soak in, and then we'll move on. Okay, next slide, please. So critical tracking events and key data elements. We talk about them as CTEs and KDEs just because it's easier, but the industry has been trying to standardize traceability for years. And in 2006, the IFT, GS1, and some other industry players got together to define the terminology for traceability. And CTEs and KDEs are a standard ways of capturing this information so that you can more easily share it. So this is something GS1 standards had already established globally for several years, all of these measures that we're seeing on the screen here. But what it allows companies and supply chain partners to do is ensure that they're speaking the same language. So critical tracking events are activities in the supply chain that must be recorded by the capture of key information. And that information is about business steps for product movement in the supply chain. And typically those events involve a product's transformation, shipping, or creation. And then KDEs are the attributes that are used to describe or support the critical tracking event. This data answers the what, where, when, who, and why of an event. Next slide, please. Thank you. So knowing that this is not purely a FSMA group, I'm guessing not too many of you have read the 597 pages of the FSMA rule. And so you aren't sure exactly what you need to do or what you would need to do to implement the requirements of FSMA. And for those that have not read it but are left trying to figure out how to implement it, they're looking like the gentleman over there on the left-hand side of the screen. There's a lot of questions about how you can meet the requirements of FSMA as you go through there, and that's really where GS1 and the supply chain stakeholders came together to kind of work together to find the common points and business practices that would allow these to be captured in a standardized way so that the information could move seamlessly from one party to another or from their repositories to the FDA's. And that's essentially the Venn diagram shows the sweet spot in the center where GS1 has focused its work. Again, I have to make it totally clear that just by looking at the GS1 documents, you still need to go through and take into consideration what your business processes are, how your company moves today to ensure that you can still meet the requirements of your business and meet interoperability questions, but also be able to meet the regulations of the law. Obviously, when you have a group of people putting together standards recommendations for meeting a regulation, that's based on the group, not on an individual company's needs. So make sure you look at those before implementing anything. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So inside of FSMA 204, this is a simplified supply chain. Again, supply chains are never this linear. But the reality is that in order to give you all an idea of how the identifiers are used, or the identifiers that we use for FSMA, and the capture devices and the share level of the pillars that we use, this is to give you a visualization on that. Again, the SSCC is purely transient. It goes for shipments only. It lasts for up to a year. Actually, there's a minimum of a year before you can reuse an SSCC. So SSCCs are able to be reused, but not until the products have left the supply chain or 1 year. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to go over some ROIs on food, talking about visibility at the and the information side of things. So really, the key takeaway on this is that product party and location information accuracy is more critical than ever, especially for the food industry. Understanding products' life cycle, shelf life, expiration dates, how much is where, enables the timely and accurate decisions that allow you to minimize waste and ensure availability for your customers. More accurate information creates better insight into on-shelf availability and the ability to manage inventory and yard processes more efficiently. And it can also enable greater freshness as food waste is minimized by using first expired, first out, or FIFO strategies. And lastly, truckload optimization depends on accurate supply chain data. 1 pound error per case of product could end up costing thousands of dollars each year if a truckload space is not properly utilized. Next slide, please. Okay. On the process side, your key takeaways here are: with greater supply chain visibility, processes can be fully optimized. And what that means is that supply chain visibility enables you to automate and create efficiencies within your warehouses around stock rotation, picking orders, and invoicing, on other common business practices. It also reduces labor costs and increases food quality and freshness, and minimizes waste. Companies can better adapt during crisis and set up contingency plans based on what product they have at any given moment, and be able to understand where products are at within the supply chain. And then, of course, food safety is a top priority to all food companies. Being able to conduct targeted, fast, and accurate recalls minimizes the risks to the consumer and the brand. Next slide, please. Thank you. So key takeaways from the consumer engagement. So as we've seen across all supply chains, is that consumers are demanding more and more information from brands, especially around their ability to understand whether or not a brand has been working with sustainable practices, and they want to be able to validate those claims. It's been found through studies that consumers expect and are willing to pay more and be more loyal to those brands and retailers that offer that data accurately and make sure that it's easily accessible. And that helps those customers make their food choices or their clothing, etc. choices, so that they can support those companies as they feel those companies deserve. Next slide, please. Okay, moving away from FSMA and moving into some DSCSA basics. So who is impacted in the DSCSA? Well, the reality is that it's anyone who handles or sells a finished human consumable prescription drug across the pharmaceutical supply chain. There are some carve-outs around nuclear medicines, plasma-derived medicines, and some other odds and ends. But by and large, it's any prescription drug that moves through the supply chain today. And the idea behind the ruling is to protect the constituency or the patients from diverted or counterfeit product that may move through the supply chain. Again, diversions occur whenever product is moved in either illicit or non-illicit manners. Some diversion occurs from cargo theft. Other diversion occurs as products are moved from one trading partner to another trading partner without accurately recording information to ensure that product was handled correctly. Um, what's required by the law? Much like FSMA, there are a lot of requirements around ensuring that you have the appropriate SOPs to be able to identify counterfeit or diverted product as product comes through your ecosystem. There are also pieces around understanding who authorized trading partners are by the law, and the law sets up licensing requirements for each member of the supply chain. Manufacturers, wholesale distributors, and dispensers are the primaries on that. Um, and what it does is it sets firm ground rules for the way that supply chain participants trade product. The last things or the last couple pieces that I will add in there is that there are document requirements around ensuring that you keep documentation for 6 years. Uh, that includes if you launch investigations for a suspect or illegitimate product to prove out their provenance or efficacy, you have to retain that information as well for 6 years, including emails, contacts, et cetera, anything that's generated in the process of that investigation. Um, Again, President Obama signed this one into law in 2013. It was intended to be a stepwise process moving through to 2023. The reality is that as we've gone through the process, the first phase was lot level, and then there were phases where 2D barcodes were required to be added to packaging, and then serialization and information started to roll out across the supply chain. And we're kind of at what's considered a stabilization point. So as of 2023, the reality is that the law has been enacted, but we are what's referred to as a stabilization period as companies get their data points connected and as the data starts flowing across the supply chain. Just recently, I think it was a week and a half ago, at this point, there has been an extension to the stabilization period, providing that trading partners have documented that they have tried to meet the processes of getting online up to this point. And essentially what's happening is as the data has started flowing, there's become a realization that exceptions are a real thing. And the FDA is trying to keep any, they would be real supply chain disruptions, but to ensure that there aren't any supply chain disruptions created by the enacting of this law. So meeting the DSCSA requirements, the reason GS1 has stepped up and moved forward to help the supply chain move to meet the law is not only because this is a traceability and visibility based law, but because there is a call out in the Title II of the DQSA or the DSCSA that refers to an internationally recognized standard to move forth and be able to help with moving data and identifying and other pieces that are required within the law. And EPCIS is an GS1 is an internationally recognized standards body, and EPCIS is an internationally recognized standard. And so to that end, the GS1 has stepped in and stepped up to help industry meet those requirements. There are some tension spots, as you see on the first bullet. The DSCSA was not written by the FDA like other laws that the FDA has to enforce. It was actually written by the House and Senate, and the reason that occurred is because at the time they started working on the DSCSA, California was coming up with the California Traceability Law, which was serialization all the way from manufacture through decommission. And Florida had a separate law, Ohio had a law, Illinois, New York, and it was starting to become more difficult to trade within the continental US than it was to sell product in the EU. And the federal government stepped up and believed that they needed to come up with a single law that would allow all states to trade equally and trade on the same footing. And so they set a floor for the serialization movement in the US. There is a requirement for product verification upon return. We'll talk a little bit about the lightweight verification messaging standard, and we'll also discuss a little bit deeper how GS1 standards are used. I've already mentioned 2D barcodes. The GS1 data matrix is the carrier of choice in US healthcare right now on the lowest saleable unit. Case level is still required for the G10 serial number, batch lot, and expiration date today. But you are seeing a growth in the 2D data matrix barcode market on that side as well. Data hub location has become very prevalent inside of the DSCSA because of the managed GLM program to ensure the community pharmacies and the small independents all have GLNs so that EPCIS can be the lifeblood of the information moving back and forth throughout the supply chain. Again, I mentioned the LVMS for verification. And lastly, EPCIS is playing a pivotal role in providing that serialization and traceability data from trading partner to trading partner. And then, there is also, and this has been identified by multiple parties, but there is a growing movement towards utilizing RFID to relieve some of the pressure of the DSCSA. One of the requirements is to ensure that at the time or before you receive a product that you have the equivalent of the serialized data for that product that has been transmitted to you in a single electronic form from the person selling it to you. The obvious answer to that is that in order to truly know that, you would have to open up every box that you received. RFID is proving that without line of sight, it has the ability to do this. Axia has been very instrumental in this movement. They completed the first leg of their supply chain pilot, phase one last year, and phase one proved out that the proof of concept that you can utilize RFID to be able to read the contents of a pallet or a tote as you would see coming out of a wholesale distributor to a pharmacy. And now they've moved on to phase two, which they'll talk about a little bit tomorrow, but it's essentially mating up that information with EPCIS documents on the backside so that when you read the tags, you can understand whether or not you have the product that you're supposed to have so that you can start that quarantine and holding process with your trade partners and move the product that you can move. All right, next slide, please. And actually, I just kind of did this slide, so you can go to the next slide, Hope. Thank you. So the standards that are in use today, and that we're using across the supply chain, this kind of breaks that down. So again, I mentioned prior to or at the time of each transaction, in which the manufacturer transfers ownership. So this is an ownership law. It's worried about who owns what as it moves through the supply chain. And in doing so, what happens typically from most of the participants in the supply chain is as the orders are picked, packed, and shipped, they create invoices and EDI documents and EPCIS documents that all get generated roughly at the same time. Those EPCIS and EDI documents get moved from the seller down to the receiver, or in this case, we'll start on the left and go from the manufacturer to the wholesaler. The wholesaler will receive that product, ensuring that the product that they receive is spelled out inside of an EPCIS document that was sent during that data transmission. They'll go through the unpacking process. They'll repack it to sell it to a downstream dispenser or another wholesaler. And in that process, they will then generate the same style of documentation that was generated for them by the manufacturer, and they will send that down to the recipient. It's important to note that once the dispenser receives the product and they've checked it into their inventory, unless there's a suspect or illegitimate concern about the product that's been received at the point of dispense, the reality is that the dispenser's larger concerns are kind of cut at the receiving door, except for in the scenarios where they have suspect or illegitimate products or concerns. And the reason I bring this up is because dispensing, destruction, and decommissioning do not actually get reported back to the manufacturer. So the way the DSCSA is set up is that it's a unidirectional data pass from one trading partner to the next trading partner. On the bottom left-hand side of the screen, you will see a GS1 data matrix that outlines the information that's held within the barcodes. Next slide, please. And this is just a kind of an infographic that I designed to kind of give a high level explanation around EPCIS. So the important thing to understand about EPCIS is that EPCIS captures object events as they occur throughout the supply chain. Most commonly in the DSCSA, the object events are around commissioning, the creation of the product, or packing. So packing several low assailable units into a case, and then packing those cases onto pallets. And then you have shipping events, which denote the movement of a product from one person or one supply chain partner to another supply chain partner. And those are a mixture of those orange boxes that you see over on the side. The other piece that you'll see on this is the light blue header and the dark blue boxes that are spread across the document. And that's whenever I talk about GS1 US working with supply chain participants, much of this information is information that's required by the law, and we have helped the supply chain put it in place. The item master data and entity master data already live. They are already extensions that exist within the definitions of EPCIS 1.2. However, oh, and I guess I should also throw in lot and expiration are also included in EPCIS 1.2 already in the global standard. Really, to meet the requirements of the DSCSA, that work group had to agree on the transaction statement, the inclusion of several business documents, PO and invoice information, denoting the ownership change, and direct purchase statements and dropship flags in order to be able to meet the requirements of the DSCSA and work through operational processes. Next slide, please. Excellent, thank you. So outside of the ARC Secure Supply Chain and working to create those, or outside of the work that we did with EPCIS to create those extensions, we've also worked with the supply chain to create implementation guidelines around promoting the different pieces of standards that have been tied together in order to enable the visibility within the healthcare supply chain. We have outlined supply chain scenarios, including scenarios for CMOs or contract manufacturing operations, and how that information and especially the commissioning information should be detailed and sent to the manufacturer so that they can in turn move that information forward in the supply chain as the product moves. It also lays out examples of the XML documents that are currently being traded between trading partners. And then lastly, I have to mention exception handling. One of the things that's been found as we've been working through the challenges of the DSCSA is that it's one thing to receive a file, it's another thing to make sure that all the data is correct, to ensure that you have all of the product and the data for your shipment. And when that doesn't occur because of either human error or data recording error, that product has to move and sit on the side until you can fix that error. And so we have been working to create best practices around what information you need to relate to your trading partner to ensure that you get the information back that you need. And additionally, I am now working with a sub-team to create choreographies and business steps around an addendum that's been made. As we get closer to serialization being fully implemented and the requirements about ensuring that the EPCs that are included in EPCIS meet or match the physical products received, there are starting to be regular occurrences and different exceptions that we were not prepared to work with. The real world is messy, obviously, and so it takes a lot of work. The other things that we've been producing out of that workflow are FAQs. And then the last piece, the lightweight verification messaging standard. that is a global standard that exists because of the DSCSA, based on the needs of the supply chain and the ability to verify product upon return. So if you're going to resell a product, you have to be able to verify that the manufacturer recognizes the SNI and the attribute data associated with that product that's encoded into the GS1 data matrix. And the lightweight verification messaging standard is a way to do that without having to have a direct connection with your trading partner. So essentially, a independent pharmacy can reach out to the manufacturer, not having to understand necessarily who they are, just by scanning the barcode and utilizing the LBMS and their solution provider. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So standards in action for DSCSA. The biggest difference between this slide and the slide that was used for FSMA is FSMA focuses on lot level tracking, whereas DSCSA focuses on instance level tracking. So DSCSA worries and tries to understand exactly where a specific product is, whereas FSMA is again looking at the lot. So it's looking lot level. And so that center capture section really needs to be able to encode the GTIN, the serial number, the batch lot, and expiration date of a given product, because those pieces of information have to be checked upon saleable return, or if there's a investigation looking at a suspect product. Lastly, GDSN, without good solid master data, it's garbage in, garbage out. Data hub location allows you to share GLN information with trading partners. And then lastly, EDI for transactional information, and then EPCIS for the serialized data push. Next slide, please. One more round of supply chain visibility wheels. We're almost there, guys. So, okay, some key takeaways from this. Again, product party and location information accuracy is now more critical than ever, especially for the healthcare industry, where you're not just denoting a location. There are two types of identification that are used inside of an EPCIS file intended to be used for DSCSA. One is a party GLN, so the overarching corporate entity is identified inside of that transaction. And then the second is a destination location that is there to tell the supply chain recipient or partners where the physical location of that product is going. And so there are other GLNs mixed in there for read points for where things happen based inside of those EPCIS events that have been snapped together. But location information is key now. Also, having good information about products enables you to, again, work with FIFO, allows you to be more accurate around your data whenever you're trying to drive flexibility of systems, especially whenever you think about nimbleness and efficiency in a supply chain right now after Hurricane Helene came through. The western part of North Carolina was hit pretty hard, and the leading manufacturer of IV solutions on the East Coast was also hit pretty hard, and their production essentially halted. I was talking to John about this a little bit earlier, that in my neck of the woods, I am in North Carolina, but I've talked to people in Maryland and South Carolina as well, and they are facing the same issue, that there are no elective surgeries happening right now because the IV shortage is so critical in this part of the US right now. The last thing that I'll say before we move on to the next screen is that shared data supports a more collaborative and efficient supply chain. That's never been more true, especially in the DSCSA. The amount of work and the collaboration I've seen in healthcare is unlike anything I've seen in any other vertical, in order to get the supply chain to be able to move as one, to be able to meet these requirements. Supply chains, again, are complex. And if everyone's not speaking the same language and everybody's not working together, it makes it 10 times harder and more complex. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I kind of touched on several of these points, and the last one, especially the second bullet point around pandemic, weather, and short supply disruptions. Uh, it's becoming more important than ever to understand where your product's at, how many you have, where you have them, so that you can accurately triage trouble spots as they start to appear. Having that data and having those metrics available allows you to understand when your reserves are getting pulled out of one area and moved to another, or it allows you to be able to move product proactively to an area that you know is going to be hit or has been hit by either a pandemic or a weather event. The other thing that happens whenever you have good processes in place around healthcare is it enables you to manage your expiration dates, handle recalls quickly and efficiently, and rotate your stock at regular inventories. The other thing that I'll say is that automated processes and collecting data about your sales as they move through, as long as your data is correct and having good data leads to better forecasts, which means you can run on a thinner supply than you would otherwise be able to run on. The safety stock is less critical if you truly understand what the metrics are driving that safety stock. And then lastly, it supports regulatory requirements. Next slide. All right. The last one is, oh, yep, you are there. I am not. Okay, there we go. So ROI Healthcare, there we go. ROI Healthcare and consumer and stakeholder engagement. It supports the 5 patient rights. Essentially right, the right patient at the right time with the right drug and the right dose and through the right route. Having the correct information. And whenever you look at the information that you pull from GDSN and that master data repository, supported by visibility data, allows you to ensure that your products are getting the right drugs at the right time. In addition, it supports the idea that the drugs will make it to the location that your patient's eventually going to be at in a timely manner. The other thing that I'll say is that as we move through and the supply chain modernizes, there's been an increasing hunger from the consumer marketplace to be able to pull information about the drugs easily and efficiently, so that they can understand what it is they're taking and what the correct indications are and what any potential side effects are relatively easily. And then lastly, this information with the consumer and stakeholder engagement increases clinician trust, confidence, and grants greater access to information. Next slide. Thank you. We're going to talk, and this is really my last slide, everybody, not this one, but the next one. We're going to talk a little bit about visibility and trust and look at some tools for the future. The reality is that some of these tools exist now. Actually, most of these tools exist now in one form or the other. Some of them GS1 is just starting to step into. Other ones have existed, but they've only been used by one vertical up to this point. And so, moving forward on those and being able to let you all know that they exist for your use is important. And so whenever we go through and talk about these things, event hashing exists today in EPCIS 2.0. It essentially gives you the ability to convert an EPCIS event into an EPCIS event hash ID using an algorithm of your choice. And then that hash can be stored in a distributed ledger, blockchain or not, in order for your supply chain partners to be able to check against it. The reality is that if they understand what your hashing algorithm is, which they should be able to rehash that object event and get the same number that you gave them or that they received in the event. And that should be able to tell them that no nefarious actors have modified any EPCIS events that they've received that are hashed inside of that grouping. Next, we have sensor data collection. So as of EPCIS 2.0, you now have the ability natively to record sensor data as products move through the supply chain. Natively, this supports, just as an example, the collection of temperature data, GPS location data, impact through impact like force and impact through newtons. And those are just a handful. Lat longe. I don't think I said that one. So yeah, that would be GPS location, sorry. But yeah, lat longe as well. And then next, the lightweight verification messaging standard allows supply chain participants to ask manufacturers whether the identification and attributes on a product are valid and recognized by that manufacturer. And that's whether or not they have a relationship with that manufacturer. And what I mean by that is most endpoints purchase through a wholesale distributor. And even if they're not, and they're doing drop ships, that drop ship billing is still routing through that wholesale distributor in the healthcare supply chain. And so ultimately, where that leaves you is that you have independent pharmacies, clinics, and other participants that have no direct connection with manufacturers. And because of the authorized trading partner requirements, manufacturers have to be able to understand that those people are authorized by law to be able to talk to them. And so the VRS network, or the verification router service network, is what supplies that surety today. And it is yeah, moving forward. And while it's not currently being utilized as heavily as it should, once the law is fully enacted, it will start being utilized for all suspect and illegitimate investigations. And lastly, we have verifiable credentials. They can either also use blockchain or not, but essentially verifiable credentials allow you to be able to tell someone is who they are based on trust. So it's a certificate trust model. Um, and we are doing several products with regulatory bodies to see if verifiable credentials are a potential vehicle to prove trust um, around the authenticity of an item or the entity that is actually trying to sell those products or move them into the United States. All right, Holly, last slide. At least I believe we're on the last slide. So, yep. So now I'm going to open up the floor for questions. I hope I didn't go too far over my time with that, Holly. Uh, Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Andrew. So for questions, um, let's see. I've got one question. You mentioned sustainability as part of visibility. Do
Mhm.
you foresee incorporating product end of life consideration or life cycle assessment data, DPP, into the U.S. pharmaceutical or food supply chain in the near future? And if so, how's GS1 preparing for that?
Yeah, and so that's a great question. And currently, GS1 US is heavily involved in the DPP movement that's occurring at GS1 Global Office. Additionally, we are starting to pivot in a way to take into consideration sustainability. What we've seen is that it would be very short-sighted to assume that DPP or some measure or something similar to DPP would not be at least adopted at some extent by the U.S. Government or the U.S. supply chain. Even in addition to that, what we're already seeing is a hunger from consumers to be able to purchase products that they know have come from um, a sustainable ecosystem. If you look at cotton that's being farmed today, or jeans or other resources that are being made and moved through the supply chain, it's been found to be very important for those consumers to be able to prove out that those products are actually sustainably built and marketed. And then in addition to that, the other part of your question about being able to look at end of life. Um, Currently, with the way that the recycling programs are going, and if you look at requirements, again, I spend my life in healthcare. If you look at the requirements that are starting to bubble up and the regulatory pressures that are starting to lean into manufacturers around how they ensure that plastics are leaving the marketplace and being used responsibly on the other end, even whenever you get to international manufacturers that are looking to do carbon offsets, you have to understand what the recycle path is for those goods. Otherwise, you can't recycle them properly. And so we have had internal discussions. We've done innovation work around being able to track products and figure out ways to announce how those products should be moved forward once they reach end of life. Hopefully that answers your question.
Excellent. So if there are other questions, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you, or you can just type them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them in the next couple of minutes.
I've either dazzled them or put them to sleep.
Maybe you dazzled. Maybe you answered every single
Um,
question.
I'm going to hope that I answered every single question. Holly, I do have one more slide,
Okay.
and this is just for, obviously I covered a boatload of material throughout my presentation. In 90 minutes, covering the amount of information that I covered, it was kind of a skim across the top, and I apologize for that because it was a boatload of information. If you have any questions at all, my day job is to answer those questions and to help industry. So don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to work with you all and answer any deeper questions about how the standards apply to something that you're trying to work on. Again, that's what I'm here
Awesome.
for. That's what I get.